Welcome to toy-polloi. No Legos were harmed in the making of this video.
Hello and welcome to another video from toy-polloi. Today we're going to be restoring this vintage Real Ghostbusters Fright Features Egon. Now recently on my social media channels I asked people to tell me what were the most common problems with these Kenner Real Ghostbusters figures, and Egon was by far the most common one that people said there was an issue with, because every single version of this figure has the tie missing. The second runner-up, I have to say, is Proton Packs. So I'm currently on the hunt for broken Proton Packs, because that does seem to cover a lot of issues. But first up I thought, well, Egon's a very easy figure to find, so I picked this one up off eBay, and as people said, every single one I saw had the tyre broken and quite a lot of paint wet, so that is what we are going to be fixing today. This Fright Features Egon I've managed to get off eBay, and I think I got a good price on it. I think it cost me £2.50 plus postage, and he came with all of his weapons and the little ghost, which I thought was quite nice. But he does have the issue that everybody was telling me about, and that is he has these features where you pull in his arm like that and his face pops up and his tie is supposed to sort of pop out, but as you can see there is a weak point on the tie just where the mechanism sort of goes into the body and it snaps off, so you end up with this little stump of a tie that doesn't really sort of shoot out when you push his arm in. And also the paint gets worn. His gloves have been painted onto white plastic, so when it gets worn you can really quite clearly see the plastic through. Likewise on his boots, they're nice sort of red paint onto white plastic, but as it wears off it really does stand out that it's worn away. And also on his hair you can see that he has got quite light coloured hair onto pink plastic, and this again has quite a lot of wear to it, so it just looks like a very scruffy figure. But with a little bit of work I think we can make this look very displayable again. And as people did mention to me, I haven't yet to actually see one of these with a tie that isn't broken, so that does seem to be probably the most common issue on this toy line. So let's get on and we'll fix up this Fright Features Egon. Now, as I say, I've not actually been able to find one with an unbroken tie, so we're just going to have to make this up. It looks like from photos I've seen the tie actually just comes down just above his belt. It's got a slight taper to it, so it gets slightly larger, and then there's a sort of classic triangular section at the bottom. So I don't think it's going to be too hard to make something like that. And also looking at the top part of the tie, there's not a great deal of detail on it, it's just flat plastic. So first thing we need to do is actually tidy up the remnants of this. You can see where it's broken, it's obviously been snapped upwards and we've got this little sort of lip. So what I want to do is actually get this surface quite flat so that we can then stick something onto it. So I'm going to use a pair of plastic nippers, which I've shown many times before, and I'm just going to trim up the end of this tie and sort of carefully cut it off so that we've got a nice surface to work on. There you go, I think that's a bit neater. We also need to rough up the surface of this, because at some point we're going to stick something onto it. So I have a small file here. In fact, this is actually a nail file, the sort of thing you file your nails with. These are very useful to have. You can buy packs of them incredibly cheaply, and for doing sort of jobs and toy repairs they are a must have. So I'm just going to very carefully file the top surface of this so it's got a bit of a roughness to it. This will be vital for later on, but we might as well get this sort of all prepped up before we get to actually attaching anything. So there you go, it's just got a slight rough surface to it now. Now we can go ahead and make the tie. And for the tie I'm just going to be using this, which is 1mm styrene sheet. You can get this from most model shops. It's very cheap and very useful for sort of repairing and mending toys. In fact, if you've watched a lot of my recent videos, you'll have seen me use this 1mm sheet and sometimes some 2mm styrene sheet for making completely new parts to toys. It's just incredibly useful. So what we're going to do is, onto a small part of this, I am going to sort of make my own version of this tie. So I'm just going to measure how long I want the tie to be, and I'm measuring right up to the sort of knot part of it, because we're going to stick something onto what's left of that bottom part. So I'm going to measure along and say the tie needs to be about 2 centimeters from the top to the very tip of the tie, and it's got to sort of taper out slightly wider, and then we'll cut a triangle in the bottom, but something about 2 centimeters long should be fine. At the top it's just about 2.5mm across, so at the bottom if we make it, I'm going to say 3mm, that should be yeah, I think that should look quite nice. So I'm just going to cut something out of this sheet that matches those measurements 2.5 millimeters to 3 millimeters, and that's 20 millimeters long. And then we can shape it and try and make something that looks like it should work. With only very few cuts, you can see I've now made something that is about the right shape. It's sort of very crude at the moment, but that's certainly going to look quite nice once it's sort of finished off. So this is just 1 millimeter stone. As I say, we now need to try and shape it a bit because it's got very hard edges. So again, I'm just going to use the file, and I'm going to carefully sort of start sanding down some of these to round off the edges on the front surfaces. It doesn't take much, it's very thin stuff, so you just have to sort of carefully go around. We'll do the same on all of these pieces and round off the edges and just gently shape it until it looks more like a tie. And it's yeah, it's a fairly straightforward job. If you go wrong, just start again. This is a nice small piece, so it's not going to take too long if you need to make it again. But I think with a little bit of filing we can make this certainly look a lot more tie-like. Yeah, I think that's already looking better. We now need to make another slight little modification to this. The original tie has a slight curve to it, so if you're going to stick this onto there, it's not going to sit flat. What we need to do is on the underside edge, you can see it's already got a little bit of a curve where I've started sanding this off. We need to put a slight curve onto the bottom surface, and to do that I have a small needle file here, which is a rounded needle file, and I'm just going to run the tie up and down this a few times, and that should just make a little curve on the back surface of it, enough that when we lay it onto the original tie it sort of starts to sit a bit flatter. So you can see there, if I just get that to focus, we've now got a slight curve to the tie, and that will be enough that when we stick this on it should sit quite flat, which does feel like it's going to. Just going to do a few more little modifications, but I think overall that is a pretty good replacement tie. By the time that's stuck in place and we paint it up, I don't think most people will notice. So that is my finished tie. You can see it's fairly simple. I have put a few little sort of sanding marks on the front there just to make it look a little bit more tie-like. You can't really see though at this size, it's such a small piece. So now what we've got to do is to stick this in place, and for that I'm just going to be using some super glue. I've got some Gorilla super glue here. You won't need very much of it at all, so I'm just going to drop an incredibly small amount onto the back of the top part of the tie like that. That's probably too much, so I'm going to just take some of that off. It's just a tiny little amount that you need, and I'm going to stick this on. We'll let that set. Just lining it up so it looks like it's in the right position. There you go. So you can now see the tie actually works again. I will let that set because it's so small, you can't really sort of put much pressure on it. So I'm just going to give that a sort of half an hour to set, and we can then start painting up the rest of the figure and we'll get the tie painted as well. But I'm already pretty happy with how that looks and how it works. Now we can get on and paint Egon's hair. We'll start at the top, might as well. So his hair is a sort of ivory colour, and to make that I'm going to be mixing two paints. I have 34 white, which is a Humbrol acrylic, and then I've also got some Vallejo. This is a flat yellow colour called 70.953, and if I carefully put a very small amount of this yellow into the white, I should be able to make this sort of ivory colour. This is just done by eye, there's no sort of technique particularly, just keep mixing it until you get something that's close. It might be that you can actually buy this sort of colour ready mixed, but I tend to just use what I have in my sort of pot of paints, and I don't have this ivory colour, so I might as well make it. So you can see there, just mixing these two colours. And that's possibly a little bit too yellow. I'll just wipe that off. I'll mix a bit more white back into that. It's just a sort of case of carefully going you know, a little bit of each time, and at some point you'll get the colour that you want. Now these are all matte acrylic paints as well, so at the end, once I've painted this, I will put a clear top coat on, which is a slightly gloss finish to make it match the rest of the paint. I think that's not too bad. Yeah, that's starting to look quite close. I'm actually going to repaint all of his hair anyway, because there's so much damage all over. I'm going to put a thin coating of this over everything, so in the end it won't really matter if it doesn't match quite perfectly, but that's a pretty close match. And you can see what a difference it makes straight away. The fact there's now no longer a scratch on the front of his quiff, I think that looks a lot better. Now the paint has had time to dry on his hair, we can move on to the next bit. I'm going to work on the red next, because there's quite a lot of sort of damage to the bottom of his boots, and there's a little bit of paint just worn there, just on the sort of collar, or the sort of shoulder pads I suppose, of his top. For that again I'm going to be using 34 white of the Humbrol, but I've also got a 238 which is a nice vibrant red, but it's just not quite the sort of right match for this. So a little bit of the 238 red with a very small dab of the white in it, and I've also actually put a bit of the yellow from the previous sort of paint for the hair in it, and that seems to get a colour that matches quite sort of closely to this red. Sometimes I would bother sort of repainting all of the boots, but as these are just such small little areas, I think we can just get away with just touching up the bits. So there you go, you can see that's quite a nice match. Again, these are all matte paints, so I will be putting a top coat over them at some point, but for now I just want to get sort of these areas hidden, and so that you can't see them. I think that's not too bad. The paints always go on a little bit lighter. You'll find that when they dry just a tad darker, so don't worry if it's not quite perfect. It should sort of even out. I think overall that is going to make quite a big difference. When you've got paint scratches on white plastic underneath, they really do show, so it's nice to get rid of them, just so that the figure is much sort of neater when you've got it on display. Now as far as the blue goes for the hands, it's a sort of bluey greeny yellow. There's no colour in my sort of pot of paints that really matches this, so I've actually just sort of mixed a load together, and I've got something that's pretty close, but I'm not going to say this is going to be the easiest way to get there. There's probably a closer match of paint out there. I just want to use what I happen to have to hand. You can see here it's got quite a tinge of green to it, so I've actually mixed a bit of these two shades of blue, which is 17925 blue and 70.84 Andrea blue, but I've also added some flat yellow and a tiny bit of olive green, which is 70.967, and I've managed to make a colour that is, I'm going to say, quite a good match. You can see that's not too bad. It's still not quite perfect, but it's certainly good enough for what I want to do here. I bet there is a colour that is a closer match than this, but for today's purposes that is what I'm going to use. So I'm going to paint this onto the gloves, and then we'll get onto the tie. The final bit is of course this tie. So again, I've just used the same blues I've got, so I'm using the Andrea blue. I've mixed a bit of white with that, and tiny little bit of yellow, because it's quite a strange shade of blue. I'm actually trying to match the paint that's on his body rather than the plastic, and I'm going to paint all of this to match that. I think I've got a blue that is pretty good, so let's just paint that down. Yeah, that looks fairly reasonable, so I'm going to paint that quite neatly now. We'll paint both the back and the front of it, and then let everything dry, and then I'll put a top coat on all of the bits I've painted, so that it has the nice sort of glossy finish that the original paint had, and that will be Egon done. Now now the paint's had time to dry, we can just put the top coat on, because as you can see at the moment it's got quite a flat matte finish to it, all the paint, especially the hair. So what we're going to do is going to use some Humbrol acrylic. This is number 135, which is a clear top coat, which will give it just that sort of sheen that you need to match this sort of original sheen that you can see here on some paint that I've not touched up. So we're going to do that over all the bits that we've painted, especially the tie, because the tie is also a very flat sort of matte colour at the moment. And then Egon will be done. So let's get this all painted on. And here you can see the finished Egon. He's looking really quite nice. The top coat that I put on the paint just gives it that little bit of a sheen. You can see here on his hair it now sort of has a bit of a gloss finish to it, and on his gloves it's actually quite noticeable. It just makes that figure look like it would have done back when you bought it. Obviously now when we press in his arm, his face pops up, and does his tie, and it sort of clips up and makes him look extra scared. So that's a nice little fix there. It's fairly straightforward to do, as you can see, and even I did put a few little details in I mentioned earlier, and those actually work quite well once you've got some paint on there. You can see that it's just got a few little lines and a few details on there, but I think this Egon is looking particularly nice now. So certainly something I would be happy to put on display here. I think it's made a big difference to him. So if you have one of these Egons with the tie missing, I suggest going down that route. Some 1mm styrene is all you need, and then a few pots of paint, and you can make him look really quite presentable. Now a lot of people like to know how I sort of get to work out these ideas, and on this one I actually had a very beaten up Egon in my sort of box of spares. It was really sort of very damaged and something I wasn't actually looking to fix up, but because I wanted to do some tests and some practice, I took that figure and I did all of my sort of test work on it, and this is what the figure ended up looking like. Compared to how he started, it actually doesn't look too bad at all. I didn't do all the fixes on this, I just wanted to test that I could actually make a tie that would work, and I wanted to also check that the paints I had would do a good job of sort of matching the original paint on it. So you can see here I didn't actually bother to repair his finger. Someone had chewed that off at some point, but I just wanted to make sure the paint would work on it. And in the end this figure's actually turned out fairly nice, and it's the sort of thing I would put in a vehicle. So I like to display all of the vehicles I have with toys in them, and something like this would fit perfectly well in there, and considering how scruffy and how damaged it was to start with, I'm really very pleased with how that turned out. So there you go, that is all the sort of tips and tricks for fixing up this vintage Kenner Real Ghostbusters Fright Features Egon. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, then make sure to hit the subscribe button and tap the bell to be notified each time I upload a new one. And thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching toy-polloi. Subscribe for more great videos. You can also follow toy-polloi on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.